Hello, class. This podcast, as it says on the screen, is about how do we get assets and expenses. So we've had two previous podcasts, what is an asset, what it is not, and this is about how do we get them. So the first way that we obtain assets that we want is to exchange one asset for another. This usually means that we take cash, which is an asset, and exchange it for an asset that we need more in our business. Cash is usually not very useful except to pay for things. Other than that, it has very little use, but we may need a machine or a building or parts to make inventory. So when we do that, we can exchange cash for another asset, and that's how we obtain that. That same thing goes for expense. If we are using an expense and exchange cash for it, that is buying that benefit or the expense. Remember, the difference is when the benefit will happen. So that's one way, is we exchange one asset for another. A second one that's very closely related is we sell an asset for another asset. Usually what we're selling is inventory. That's the stuff we make in order to sell, and we sell it for either cash or for a promise from the customer to pay us later, which is a receivable and is an asset. So we're exchanging our inventory. Say we're selling shoes. We're exchanging the shoes we have made or whatever to the customer, and they are giving us either cash or a promise to pay us in the future. So that's a very common and probably the most common way we get asset. So the first one is about exchanging cash to get a more valuable asset like machinery. Second one is about selling our assets and usually receiving cash or a promise to pay cash in the future. Sometimes if we do not have the cash or we do not have another way to obtain an asset, we can borrow the cash and then exchange the cash for another asset. Or we can borrow the asset outright with the promise to the other side of the transaction. Whoever we're getting the asset from, we promise them that we'll pay them in the future, usually with interest, but not always. Sometimes it will be short time that we'll pay them. And that's the same thing with an expense. If we use something now and promise to pay for it later, that would be an expense with an associated liability. But we're not going to confuse the two. We're not going to mix up the asset or expense with the liability. For instance, if I buy a house and borrow the money to do so, I have an asset, the house, and a liability separate, the promise to pay for it over time. They are not the same thing. They are two different things, and we have to account for them separately. That's an important thing. So that's where we separate the difference between what an asset is and a liability. And then last and the least common is we get it from the owners of the business. So the other way that we can have an asset is the owner or owners of the business, partners or shareholders, give assets into the business in return for ownership in the business or increased ownership in the business. And that's the fourth way. So that's the only ways that you could consider or you could obtain assets. Really has to be one of those four ways. And the same thing with expenses.